Hello. Today I'm going to be reviewing A Game of Thrones by George R. R. Martin. Now, before I get into my review, I do want to explain my sort of familiarity with the Game of Thrones world. I'm reviewing this after the first time I've read this book. I've not read any of the other books before, unless you want to count Fire and Blood, which I have read. It's more of a fake history book, but however, I have seen the entirety of the TV series, and I was a huge fan. I have spent quite a lot of time perusing Game of Thrones videos on YouTube, discussions about like theories and all that kind of stuff. So, although I haven't read the books yet, except for this first one that I'm about to review, I am quite familiar with a lot of the things that happen in the books. And I obviously have a lot of love for the world of A Game of Thrones or the Song of Ice and Fire. Now, because of this, first of all, I'm going in perhaps a little bit biased, but also, more importantly, I have a lot of familiarity with it. See, this book has a lot of characters, there's a lot of names and a lot of things that just get named and then not expanded upon until later. Now, most of these things, or most of these people that are named, I kind of know who they are or what they are. And obviously, I'm already familiar with most of the characters, so it does give me an advantage. Like, there's a lot of characters, a lot of names, and a lot of places, a lot of things. If you have no familiarity with the series whatsoever and you jump straight into it, maybe it could be a bit too much. I'm not really sure. I can't comment on that because obviously I came into this series already being quite familiar with it from the show and from online and all that. Anyway, so I just wanted to preface my review with that. I'll get straight into my review now. It's a complex narrative. There's quite a few characters that have POV chapters, and the narrative is quite complex. There's a lot of moving parts. Different characters go in to different areas and have different stories, and some of these stories kind of intersect. Some of them are a little bit more out of the way, but generally most of the characters that we have a perspective from are in the Stark family. So we have Eddard Stark and his wife Catelyn Stark, and they have 5 children. There's Robb, Sansa, Arya, Bran, and Rickon. There's also Jon Snow, who is the bastard son of Eddard Stark. However, his mum is not Catelyn Stark. Basically, all the main characters are Starks, with one exception I'll get to a bit later. So Eddard, Catelyn, Jon Snow, Arya, Sansa, Bran, they all have POV chapters, and they've all got this sort of stories that they go on. Now, Rickon, he's like 3. He's a bit too young. He doesn't have POV chapters. And although Robb is an important character, he also doesn't get POV chapters. But aside from that, they're all got POV chapters, and they've all got their own sort of things that they do. So the plot really kicks off when Jon Arryn, who is the hand of the king, basically the king's like 2IC, he dies. He dies suddenly. It's initially believed to be sickness. However, Catelyn Stark's sister sends a letter stating that she suspects he was poisoned. Now, because the hand of the king is dead, Robert Baratheon, who is the king, comes over to Winterfell, which is where the Starks live. And he asks Eddard Stark to be his hand of the king, is to replace Jon Arryn. And although Eddard is initially hesitant, he eventually decides to do it. Before he can leave, though, his son Bran ends up falling from a tower. Now, it's assumed that he fell, but those who know him closest don't think that he would have fallen, because he's too good of a climber to have fallen, they think. And they're right, because we learn the truth in Bran's chapter, and that's that he discovers two people at the top of a tower getting it on. Now, one of these people getting it on is the Queen, and the other person is her brother. The Queen's brother ends up pushing Bran out the window, and he falls into a coma for a while, but eventually he wakes up. However, after the fall, he's unable to walk or even feel anything in his legs. While he's recovering, before he wakes up from his coma, that is, there's an assassin who tries to kill him. That the assassin ends up getting killed. So lots of bad things are going on. A lot of the Starks start to suspect that it's the Lannisters that are involved. The Lannisters are another powerful family. The Queen is Cersei Lannister. You also have Jaime Lannister, her brother, who she's in an incestuous relationship with, but that's secret, because if people found out, that would be very bad for them. There's also Tyrion Lannister. He actually has POV chapters as well. He's the only Lannister that gets POV chapters in this book. He is a dwarf, not like a Tolkien dwarf or a D&D dwarf, but like someone with dwarfism dwarf. That's the general setup. You got some bad things sort of start happening, and it's made pretty clear that the Lannisters are up to no good. Anyway, so I'll give you a basic little overview of each character's sort of story. Eddard Stark. Now, Eddard, he ends up accepting the king's offer to be Hand of the King. So he goes to the capital city of King's Landing. Now, while there, Eddard has to do his duty as Hand of the King and do his job or whatever. And on the side, he's sort of investigating what really happened with Jon Arryn. And eventually he ends up uncovering what's really going on. Bran. So after his fall, Bran has to sort of learn to get used to not being able to move around on his own. However, he does have a couple of methods of getting around. Tyrion actually helps him to design a special saddle that he can use to ride around on a horse. There's also this man, Hodor, who's named such because he says only Hodor. Anyway, Hodor is this massive beast of a man, and he is able to carry Bran around wherever Bran needs to go. Now, Bran's story in this book, there's not a whole lot to it. It's mostly him just sort of learning to get used to his thing, and he's sort of starting to learn about some of the more fantastical elements of the story, which will come into play later on. But for now, there's not a whole lot to go on. Catelyn. Now, Catelyn starts the book out by sort of investigating what's going on with the Lannisters a bit. She ends up going to King's Landing on a boat and meets Eddard there. They talk for a bit, and then she's riding back home. Now, what she learns is that Tyrion Lannister owned the blade that the assassin had that tried to kill Bran. Now, this turns out not to actually be true, but Catelyn believes it. And when she runs into Tyrion at an inn, she has him captured, and then she takes him to her sister. Tyrion ends up demanding a trial by combat, and he ends up convincing a sellsword to fight on his behalf in this trial by combat. And after this sellsword named Bronn defeats his opponent, Tyrion is declared innocent, so he's able to leave. By capturing Tyrion Lannister, Catelyn sort of started a war between the Starks and the Lannisters. Yeah. And now she's lost her prisoner. Whoopsie! So she goes back to Winterfell, and then she helps Robb Stark for the rest of the book as he gathers up all of the people loyal to the Stark family, and they march south to go to war with the Lannisters. Sansa. Sansa's story is... It starts out pretty basic. Like, there's not much to Sansa's character at the start. She's just your stereotypical lady who's likes, heroes, and she was infatuated with the handsome prince, and she's dreaming about the day when she can marry this handsome prince and all that. It's very like stereotypical fantasy lady trope sort of thing. She is infatuated with the king's son, Joffrey. She's betrothed to him, so they're arranged to be married later on when they're a bit older. And she goes with her father to King's Landing. Overall, there's not a whole lot that happens with Sansa. Like, initially she's fairly annoying. However, she does have a moment later on where reality sort of hits her like a massive brick to the face. And after that, she becomes a lot more interesting of a character, but it's quite near to the end. And you don't get much time with this sort of version of Sansa. So yeah, I don't really have a whole lot to say about her. I'll have to wait till the next book to see how she progresses. Arya. Now Arya also goes with Eddard, but unlike her older sister Sansa, Arya is a bit more of a tomboy, I guess. She likes to go out and explore. She's not really into like sewing and all that other stuff. She wants to like learn how to sword fight. She's actually given a sword by her brother Jon. Anyway, her story gets kicked off when on their journey to King's Landing there's an incident between the Prince Joffrey and Arya. See, Arya was training with some, like, they were fighting with like sticks or whatever. She and her friend Micah, who is the butcher's boy. Joffrey comes over and he's a real dick to them. And there's a whole incident, and Joffrey ends up getting attacked by Arya's direwolf. Anyway, the butcher's boy runs away and he ends up getting chased down and killed by the Hound, who is Joffrey's personal bodyguard. Arya manages to get her direwolf to run away so that they don't catch it. But the Lannisters are very angry and they end up demanding that Sansa's wolf get put down instead. This whole incident sort of drives Arya and Sansa apart a bit. Not that they were very close to begin with, they don't really like each other, but this drives them even further apart. And it also gives Arya a reason to hate Joffrey and Cersei and the Hound. Once in King's Landing, Eddard ends up hiring this person, Syrio Forel, who is a swordsman, and he hires this Forel character to help train Arya. Jon Snow. Now, Jon's story is a little bit more disconnected from the other ones. He starts out in Winterfell. He travels north to join the Night's Watch, which is this group of men that occupy these castles along the wall, and they basically guard all the southern kingdoms from whatever is up north. And this includes the wildlings, which are just any people that are born north of the wall. However, there are also other more fantastical threats. Now, Jon's story it sort of begins with him going to Castle Black, which is one of the castles along the wall. Now, initially, no one there really likes him, but he manages to eventually turn these people around and make some friends. Now, in terms of like plot related things, some spooky things start sort of happening. There's been disappearances, lots of disappearances. Even Jon's uncle, Benjen Stark, has disappeared. He disappears at some point in the start of the book and isn't seen from again. Much later on, Jon and some of the other Night's Watch brothers discover 2 dead men, but most curiously is, despite the fact that they seem to have been dead for quite a while, they haven't quite rotted the way that they should have. They end up taking them back to Castle Black, and that night they both seemingly come to life, and one of them tries to kill the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, but Jon Snow is able to fight it off and save the Lord Commander when he sets this dead man on fire. Tyrion Lannister. Now, Tyrion's story, it takes him all over the place. So he starts out in Winterfell, then he ends up heading further north with Jon to the Wall. Not to join, he just wants to see it, and he figures he's probably not going to go that far north ever again, so now's his best chance. So he follows Jon north, he bombs around at Castle Black for a while before he heads back. And then he gets most of the way to King's Landing. He stops at this inn on the way to King's Landing, which is where he runs into Catelyn Stark, who, as I mentioned earlier, ends up capturing him. So then he gets dragged along to the Eyrie, where Catelyn's sister lives, and there he gets put on trial for supposedly ordering the assassination of Bran, which he didn't do. But thanks to the sellsword Bronn, who helps him out in his trial by combat, Tyrion is able to walk free of that. And then he goes and joins his father in the war between the Starks and the Lannisters. And he ends up taking part in a battle. He does quite admirably, and even manages to capture a knight, I believe. And then there's Daenerys. Yeah. I left talking about Daenerys till last because, yeah. So, basically, the Targaryens were the kings until Robert Baratheon overthrew the Mad King, King Aerys II. Most of the Targaryens were killed, except for 2. Daenerys and her brother Viserys. And they fled east across the sea, and they're living in a place called Pentos. Now, Viserys wants to sail over and take his throne back, and as part of wanting to do this, he ends up getting his sister to marry Khal Drogo. Now, Khal Drogo is in charge of this Khalasar. They're like nomadic warriors. So Daenerys marries this Khal Drogo. They go further east, bum around for a bit. Viserys grows increasingly more annoyed and wondering when he's going to finally be able to go take his throne. He gets increasingly annoyed throughout Daenerys' chapters and sort of takes his frustration out on Daenerys a few times. This does not go very well for him because he ends up doing the stupidest thing ever and threatening her right in front of Khal Drogo with a weapon in their sacred place where they're not allowed to have weapons. And then he gets killed because, I mean, what did you expect? Daenerys, on the other hand, she gets pregnant, and she and Khal Drogo grow closer and closer until there's this point where he gets injured in a battle. It's a very minor wound, but Daenerys wants someone to look to it, so she gets this Magi to help the Khal. This turns out to be a very bad idea, because the Magi has no intention of helping Khal Drogo and actually makes his condition worse. So he ends up dying, I think. He's on the way to being dead, but Daenerys convinces the Magi to use some magic to bring him back to life or prevent him from dying. It's one of the two. Anyway, it ends up costing the life of Khal Drogo's horse, Daenerys' child that's still inside her, and some other people who die. But Khal lives, except he's basically brain dead. But his body's technically alive. Daenerys is devastated by this and ends up suffocating him, so he dies for real this time. And then she has this big funeral pyre where she burns this Magi, and then she ends up stepping in it herself, but she's left unharmed. And in the end, this whole big fire thing ends up hatching her 3 dragon eggs. She had 3 dragon eggs the whole time. And that's how the book ends. Now, overall, Daenerys' chapters were very uncomfortable for me to read. They're probably the most violent of the chapters, which isn't the part that concerns me. I don't mind the violence. There's a lot of bad things that the Khal does. They run around, they murder and rape and pillage. They're really, really, really bad people. There's a lot of nasty things we see. Now, we do see there's a lot of nasty things in the book overall. For the Lannisters in particular, they do a lot of nasty things when they go to war. But in the Daenerys chapters, that's when we really get to see the worst of the stuff. And it's just sort of weird that I don't know. Are we meant to feel bad when Khal Drogo dies? Because I don't. I don't feel bad for him because he's a murderer. He runs around committing genocide pretty much. And he and his people rape people to death, essentially. Also, the whole... I don't want to call it a romance, but... See, Daenerys and Khal Drogo get married, and they have a lot of sexy times throughout this book, which is very, very uncomfortable to read about when she's 13 years old at the start of the novel. Yeah, thanks, George. That's what I wanted to read about. I'm so glad you included that. Also, I'm pretty sure that most of the times that they are intimate are not very consensual on Daenerys' part, which is another yikes. But yeah, and despite these things, she is genuinely distraught when he's dying later. I just can't bring myself to enjoy the Daenerys chapters. No. Aside from all of that stuff, that the rest of the book is really good. Now, in particular, I think my 3 favourite POV characters, first of all, Eddard Stark. His chapters were very good, and they sort of continued down that investigative angle as he tries to figure out what's going on with Jon Arryn's death. Arya's chapters were really good as well. Arya is just a very intriguing character. She doesn't really fit in with how Westerosi society expects ladies to act and behave. She doesn't really want to like go marry some, noble somewhere and be a housewife or whatever. And I mean, I can't blame her. I wouldn't want to do that either. And then Jon Snow, his chapters are pretty good as well. Mostly because he and all his all the friends he makes are quite good characters, and it's pretty cool to see how he goes from being very disliked by everyone to like joining the friendship group, and they're all like brothers there. His whole arc's all about like being mature enough to stick to your duty. So there's many times when he wants to leave, but he has to stay at the Night's Watch because it's a life service. You go once you're in it, that's it. You're there for life. There's actually a part later on where he wants to ride south to help his family, and his friends ride after him to bring him back at the last minute. It's a pretty cool little moment. Now, honestly, what I really like about this book is a few things. First of all, it's a very complex narrative. All these different characters have their own sort of stories that intertwine with one another and give you more pieces of the puzzle. And it's a very tense and suspenseful novel. Like, even knowing what happens, it is very suspenseful, and I found myself wanting to read more and more and more just to see how things are going to happen, even though, yes, I already technically knew. So yeah, I would definitely recommend this book. I know I've spent most of this review just talking about the different characters and what they sort of do, but like, the characters are really the main selling point of this series, I think. The characters are outstanding, their dynamics are outstanding, and they're multifaceted as well. And this is only really the beginning. Like, this book is really, I don't want to say it's all set up. I can see how it's like, there's a lot of setup for later things, but it is a pretty good story. And yeah, the main reason I think it's so good is just the characters. Like, they're really the main selling point, I think. They all feel like real fleshed out, well nuanced people. And yeah, I'm very excited to read the next book in the series. I can't wait to see how all the characters develop. I don't know about Daenerys though. I would rather not have to read more of that. But I mean, she's out of that icky marriage, so that's good. Anyway, that is my review of A Game of Thrones. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you found it helpful, and I would highly recommend the book. I will see you guys in the next one. Goodbye. And Starks are some of the Starks are starting to suspect what stuff's going on. God, why is it speaking so hard today?